The layout of our application is pretty well coming together at this point. However, if I enter in some clearly invalid email and then click on the submit button, I'm presenting no feedback to my user to let them know that this email is not valid. So in this section, we're going to start turning to the actual submission of this form and figuring out how we can validate the values inside these inputs and then eventually access the values that the user entered. So to get started, we're going to take a look at a quick diagram that's going to lay out this process. Okay, so here's the steps. Everything is going to start up here with step number 1, the user pressing that submit button. It's only when a user presses the button that we're going to start the validation process. When a user presses the button, the onPressed callback that we added to our raised button widget is going to be invoked. So if you recall, down at the bottom, we have our submit button right here. Here's the raised button widget, and on the raised button, we added the onPressed callback. So anytime a user presses the button, this function right here is going to be invoked. So this function is going to be the perfect location for you and I to add some location to attempt to validate the form and then eventually access the values inside of it. So once we add that callback in, or I guess we already did, once that callback is invoked, we're going to attempt to access the form widget. And we're going to tell that form widget, hey, you need to validate all of your text form field children. So quick reminder, here's our widget hierarchy. Inside of our hierarchy of the login screen, we created that form widget, and we just very quickly brushed over it. So inside of our build method right here, here's the build method, here's where we created a form widget instance. So we need to get direct access to that form. And we need to tell it, hey, you need to find all of your text form field children, and you need to tell them that they need to validate themselves and make sure that they have appropriate inputs. Now behind the scenes, anytime that we place a form widget with some text form fields as a child to it, the form gets this kind of behind the scenes direct connection to those child text form field widgets. So this form right here knows about the existence of this text form field, and it knows about the existence of this text form field. That's a behind the scenes connection that is made for us automatically. And it doesn't matter that there's the column widget in between. The form just knows that these text form fields exist as children. So all we have to do is get access to the form widget itself and tell it to go find its children and attempt to validate them. Then, if all those different fields are valid, we're going to then attempt to actually extract the values that a user entered into them. And then once we have those values, well, that's the last step here, and we'll figure out what we'll do when we get there. We definitely have a lot of stuff to do before that. So in terms of difficulty, or the actual implementation of all these steps, I think you'll agree with me that step number 1 and 2 right here are pretty straightforward. Like, we really know how to add that callback in. We already did it right here. So it's really step 3 where things get interesting. On step number 3, we need to somehow get a reference to the form widget. And we need to somehow run a method on it that tells it to try to find its children and validate them. So that's going to be the hard part here. Let's take a quick pause right now. We'll come back to the next section and talk about how we're going to achieve step number 3.